And we are now joined with Alex and Rayanne of the Kamloops Sexual Assault Counseling Center. Thank you so much for joining me today, ladies.
Thanks for having us.
All right. So we did want to speak to, just to get the conversation going, is that with the COVID-19 restrictions across the world, across Canada, and here in British Columbia, we've seen an increase in domestic violence. What can you tell us about that increase during the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean we've definitely seen that reflected at KSAC with our clients, both current clients and with new intakes. So we're seeing not just an increase in numbers. We are having a lot more assessments and intakes happening, more calls to our crisis line. But what we're also noticing is that with the people we engage with our clients, there's also an increase in severity. So the kind of violence that we're seeing is more severe. The complexity of situations is more severe, with those added pressures that the pandemic brought. So be that by financial, job loss, additional stress, having to figure out childcare. That's been really hard for families to try and navigate through. And we see that those additional stresses often lead to increased severity and complexity in domestic violence situations.
So, what can be done to combat the violence when we're still in this pandemic? We're still facing the restrictions.
So certainly, the most important thing you can do for the people in your life is to keep checking in on them. So this pandemic meant that people that were living in precarious situations or in violent situations, they lost a lot of their supports, whether that be professional supports or natural supports with friends and families. We didn't have as many eyes on in the community. We didn't have as many touch points for clients. Kids being out of school is a huge one. That's where a lot of these types of incidences are noticed and flagged and then directed to support services. So as community members, as friends, as colleagues, we need to make sure that we are checking in with the people in our life, letting them know that we are safe people for them to come to with that information, and then supporting them if they do choose to disclose violence. There's not really a whole lot we can do individually in terms of major change. Of course, advocating to government for increased funding and services, that's always important. But on an individual level, the most important thing you can do is to stay connected to the people in your life.
Okay. Can you tell us what the Stop the Violence program is, and also where is it offered?
So Stopping the Violence program, it's a counseling service provided to support women identified survivors who have experienced gendered violence. By gendered violence, I mean domestic violence, historical childhood sexual abuse, sexual assault. So the program is offered in communities across BC. KSAC specifically offers it in Kamloops, Chase. I personally work with women identified survivors in Ashcroft out of the South Cariboo Elizabeth Fry Society and in Logan Lakes Health Center. So anyone that's seeking support can find our contact information on our website at ksacc.ca.
Now, can you tell us what sexual abuse intervention is? What does that mean? What are some of the signs that we would look out for?
Yeah, so there's two pieces there. The sexual abuse intervention program, the formalized program that we have at KSAC, is meant for children. So that's an MCFD funded program designed for children under 19 who have experienced sexual abuse. And so that's it's a counseling program and support services for those folks. In terms of supporting and looking for signs, again, it's just a matter of staying connected to your community, especially with children not having eyes on them for the last year and a half, really has meant that a lot of that stuff has gone undetected. So really just staying connected to community and the people in your life.
How does sexual abuse separate or differ from sexual exploitation and human trafficking?
It's tough because these are all terms that get, there isn't, I don't think, one uniform definition for any of these things, right? We talk about gendered violence and assault and rape and domestic violence and abuse. We see these all at CASAC as forms of gendered violence, and gendered violence is any kind of violence that is perpetuated against a person because of their gender or sexual identity. And so most of the time for us, that is violence against women being perpetrated by men, but of course that's not the only experience. So the language that we use at the center when we're talking about sexual abuse, typically that's an experience that's held by children. Sexual assault is the assault, a sexual assault, what lots of people would call rape. And then domestic violence is any form of violence that's used within an intimate partner setting or within a family home. So if children are experiencing domestic violence in their family home, that's also domestic violence.
Mm-hmm. Now, what does CASAC believe in when it comes to this very big subject, and how does it differ from other organizations' points of views on human trafficking and sexual exploitation?
So the biggest misconception is that sex work is always the same as sexual exploitation. And in CASAC's view, that's not the case. So we recognize the human right of every person to bodily autonomy and to make decisions about their own lives. And sometimes that might mean engaging in sex work. And we respect folks enough to make decisions for themselves and not to judge them based on, moral standards that might not be true for us. Mm. So the difference there is that sexual exploitation is done through coercion, threat of violence, that sort of thing. Whereas sex work is a person choosing to engage in the commercial sale of sexual services. And that's a differentiation that not every organization that does anti-violence work agrees with. It's not necessarily reflected in Canadian law. Canadian law focuses very much on the criminalization of prostitution is the language that they use, wherein the sale of sexual services is not illegal, but the purchase of sexual services is, which by and large makes sex work illegal. And our opinion is that to conflate the two and to assume that sex work is always sexual exploitation, it removes a person's autonomy in making those choices in their own life. And it also puts people at risk because we know that sex workers who experience violence are far less likely to report to police, to seek support services, whether that be counseling or medical interventions or anything like that. And that's because of the stigma that these kinds of views perpetuate against sex workers.
Okay, wow, this definitely sounds like a bigger subject. What can people do to educate themselves on this subject in your point of view?
I think it's just important for people to think critically about the issue and to not assume that every activist or organization working in this setting is going to have, views that are in alignment with your own. And I think it's really hard for folks to separate what the choices that they might make for themselves and the choices that another person might make. Mm-hmm. So just because you would choose not to engage in sex work, that doesn't mean it's not a valid choice for another person that might want to do that for their line of work. And there's nothing wrong with that. So I think it's really doing some critical reflecting on some of our own biases and those entrenched moral systems that we're so steeped in our society, and using that lens to review the research and the experts working in the field. So anytime you're looking at a presentation or literature or a website or anything, regarding sexual exploitation is to think about it through that lens of, who is this trying to criminalize? Who is this stigmatizing? And who is it lifting up?
Okay. Now, many people believe that this subject, sexual abuse, trafficking, and violence, these are subjects that are considered city problems or urban problems. However, should rural residents who live in remote communities, such like we do, be aware of signs and actively look at prevention?
The answer is yes. There's a misconception that sexual abuse, violence, and specifically trafficking occurs only in big cities like Vancouver. And people think that they're just taken across the borders in these big trucks, but reality is that it's happening in our own backyards, in our rural communities like Ashcroft, to the people that we know and love. Vulnerable women and girls are targeted, they're groomed and sexually exploited, and Aboriginal women and girls are exceptionally vulnerable due to the long-term impacts of colonization. 97% of trafficking survivors are women and girls. So communities can become aware of the signs, and it could increase safety. So some signs could be a sudden interest in a partner that's much older, coming home with new clothing and expensive items without having the money to buy them, avoiding missing school or work, sudden changes in behavior. This grooming can start when a perpetrator feels a void for someone. Right? This void could be that they don't feel connection to their community or anyone. So I think that communities can create safety and support for at-risk youth that by investing in them and forming connections, this could be a start of prevention.
And if somebody does feel that there are some concerns, what can they do? What numbers can they call?
They can call our case back and get some information from us.
Okay. Now, you also offer violence against men counseling. What can you tell us about the statistics that men face, and what can we do to support men in abusive relationships?
Yeah, so we know that violence doesn't discriminate. Folks of all genders, sexualities, and identities experience violence. Women do experience it at a disproportionate rate, but absolutely men do experience violence. We know that about 1 in 6 men in Canada in their lifetime will experience sexual violence, and about 20% of reported domestic violence situations are male victims. So it does happen. It's, again, statistics are not super reliable in this area because reporting is such a difficult and challenging thing for survivors to do. And this is true for both men and women survivors. The most important thing we can do is to work to destigmatize having had an experience of violence. And I think this is especially true for men. We fall into these gender roles where men are not supposed to be victimized, right? That's not the patriarchal role that they're supposed to play in our world. And so to admit that you've had that experience of victimization, that's really hard for men, and they faced a lot of stigma around that. So talking about it, empowering men to share their experiences, and to consider what they can do in their own lives to uplift other men who have had experiences of violence.
Do you think it's necessary to share their stories, for men to share their story of violence and abuse?
That's a very personal experience, and it's up to each survivor what they want to do with it. And I think this is the case for survivors of all genders. Some people find power in sharing their experience, in finding others with a common experience. And for some, we have to acknowledge that it's not safe for them to do so, whether that be because they're still in a violent relationship, or their perpetrator might still be a risk to them, or also sometimes within our own communities. These experiences can have implications for our employment, for our social circles, even within family groups. So there's a risk in sharing stories. So I never say that a person should or must share their experience. It's really about their own comfort level. I'd love to see us living in a world where it was encouraged and there was safety for every survivor to share their story. But unfortunately, we're not there yet. So it's up to each person to decide if that's something that's safe and comfortable for them.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. Now, as we wrap things up, is there anything else that you would like our rural and Indigenous audience to know?
I think it's... Sorry, go ahead, Ray.
Just becoming aware that there is services out there. And I think that we can work together just to stop the stigma of what it means to come forward.
Mm-hmm. And that there's, historically, social service agencies haven't always been safe places for Indigenous women and girls. We know that and we acknowledge that, and we're working to decolonize the work that we're doing. And so we are doing everything we can to create safety for these communities, for rural communities, for Indigenous women and girls, and really for all survivors. So if I can leave you with one thought, it's that we are here for you, that you're not alone, that this experience doesn't define who you are as an individual, as a person in your community, and that help is available.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alex and Rayanne, for your time today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.